Hello, everyone. Can you hear me properly? Also in back? Yes? Okay, perfect. Thank you. So, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you here. My name is Michael Mehling. I'm Executive Director of the MIT Center for Energy and Environmental Policy Research. And on behalf of my center, but also the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change, and the Program on Science, Technology, and Society at Harvard University, I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's panel, which we have ambitiously titled The Paris Climate Summit, Prospect for a Global Agreement. As you probably know, by the end of this month, we'll have about 40,000 people converging on Paris, including over 80 heads of state and government in Paris-les-Bourgets for the latest session, the 21st session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, better known under the acronym COP21. Now, anyone who has attended one of these COPs will be left with a distinct recollection and probably mixed feelings about that experience. It's very hard to sort of try to convey the sheer intensity, the confusion, and the emotional ups and downs of any of these gatherings, which is compounded usually by the state of utter exhaustion which one has after 2 weeks of consecutive 18-hour days. I suspect that some of you, at least, have not had that questionable and certainly memorable experience. And also, many of you are probably baffled by the acronym soup of international climate cooperation. And so before I introduce our distinguished panel, we had agreed that it might make sense to have a very brief overview or summary of what this COP means, the context, or let's say the shortest UNFCCC in a nutshell summary that was ever attempted. So here goes. In 1992, a little bit over 20 years ago, and building on several years of intergovernmental negotiations, the international community came together in Rio to agree a framework convention on climate change, which followed a model of framework conventions with subsequent protocols, etc., which had been tested successfully in other areas of environmental diplomacy. This international and legally binding treaty is quite remarkable. Its acronym, by the way, is UNFCCC, as you might have gathered. It's remarkable in many different ways. It entered into force in 1994, and it has since garnered one of the largest memberships of any international regime out there, with over 190 parties who have signed and ratified the convention. Importantly, that also includes the United States, which signed it and then ratified it during the presidency of President George Bush Sr. at the time. And in those roughly 20 years of being in force, the UNFCCC, which has its operational headquarters in Bonn in Germany, has grown to have a staff of several hundred people, has an annual budget in excess of $100 million, and definitely is thus sort of one of the better endowed institutions out there in general, sort of in international relations, and certainly has more substantive expertise, administrative capacity, and technical infrastructure than pretty much any other treaty-based environmental regime. But from the outset, it was pretty clear that this convention, this framework convention, was not meant to solve the problem of climate change. So it primarily consists of some general objectives and some relatively open-ended principles. And the operational details and specific commitments were to be negotiated in subsequent meetings of the sort of supreme authority, the highest decision-making body under this regime, the Conference of the Parties. And so now you know the second acronym that I mentioned before, the COP. And that is a gathering each year of representatives of all the parties who are members of the regime. In keeping with that rationale, very soon after the UNFCCC entered into force, we had the first such session, the first COP in Berlin, which adopted a mandate to negotiate a subsequent, more detailed, more robust, more ambitious protocol. And a few years later, in Kyoto in 1997, precisely that was signed, including by the US, but as you probably know, a few years later, under George Bush Jr., the United States decided to withdraw from that protocol. It still entered into force, so by 2005, it had entered into force, but critically, it only set out commitments for the period 2008 to 2012, quantified emissions limitation and reduction objectives, and more importantly, it only did so for a small set of industrialized countries, and now that the US had withdrawn, the major emitter, the largest single emitter internationally, was not even a party to that regime. So after the Kyoto Protocol entered into force, the next round of COPs in Montreal and in Bali already started working on the next regime, the next iteration of sort of this international climate regime. And that climate regime was supposed to not only include commitments for at least some of the major emerging economies, so not just industrialized countries, which was incidentally the main reason the US decided to withdraw, but in doing so also make sure that the US can rejoin the international climate regime, as well as some other somewhat reluctant industrialized nations like Canada, Australia, and others. All of this sort of led to what many have called the train wreck of Copenhagen in 2009. In the icy winter of Copenhagen, negotiations pretty much came to an almost or a near breakdown, and in a last-minute deal among a small group of heads of state, a short compromise document was agreed upon, which in a way kept the process alive, but really was an utter disappointment for pretty much all observers of the process, or at least a vast majority. I have many colleagues and friends, and I think any of you probably know some too, who were really, really depressed after that COP. And it really just was sort of a gap filler. But interestingly and importantly, this short compromise document did manage to soften that sacrosanct division between developing and developed economies, so that some major emerging economies, quite a number in fact, did pledge voluntary bottom-up contributions or commitments for the period between 2012 and 2020. Still, it was pretty clear this was going to be time limited. It was also clear that those pledges that had been submitted would not achieve what we need in order to stabilize atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations at safe levels. And so, same game, same routine again right after Copenhagen, Cancun, and then especially in Durban. Another mandate was adopted for the negotiations to continue, this time on a regime for the period after 2020. And that's exactly sort of the context of what's happening now and why we're heading towards Paris, again with relatively high expectations, maybe not quite as sky high as they were before Copenhagen. We've become somewhat tempered in our faith in international diplomacy, but still we're expecting this summit in a couple of weeks to come out with what the Durban mandate defined as a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. The one difference, I would say perhaps, compared to Copenhagen is that now we do really know that we're pretty much out of time. We don't have the luxury of trying this yet again 2 or 3 times in 5 to 10 year intervals. So this is where it counts, and this is where many observers say it's the make it or break it moment for international climate diplomacy in the sort of UNFCCC or UN-led tradition. And so many people, including at an event yesterday at Harvard, are discussing alternative approaches, club models, and bottom-up, not so formal, not so universally inclusive, etc., approaches to trying to tackle the big challenge of international climate cooperation. And that is precisely also the topic that we want to discuss with our illustrious panel tonight. What can we realistically expect from COP21 in Paris in 3 weeks' time? We have a stellar panel, and I do them great injustice by introducing them only very, very briefly. I certainly would invite them to expand on their own experience and their role in this many, many years long process. I think it'll give us a nice sequence of views and insights from different perspectives on that question that I just introduced. Let's start introducing our first speaker, Henry Jacoby. He's the William F. Pounds Professor of Management Emeritus at the MIT Sloan School of Management next door. Was the former director, in fact, the founding director of the center I work for, and a former co-director of the MIT Joint Program on the Science and Policy of Global Change. And that program just came out with a report titled "Launching a New Climate Regime." It couldn't be more pertinent, which Jake, that's how we know him, Jake and Henry Chen just released a couple of days ago, which looks at the intended nationally determined contributions that have been submitted in this process leading up to COP21 in Paris to date, and tries to give us a sense of, well, will it really achieve what we need to have coming out of this important moment in international climate diplomacy? He will then be followed by Professor Michael Grubb, who is Professor of International Energy and Climate Change Policy at University College London, and has also had a number of different involvements in official capacity in international and domestic climate policy and politics. So comes to us with a broad range of experiences and knowledge, and has been working on this for time immemorial, really a veteran of international climate policy, to look at also some of the theoretical challenges that are making it so hard to get to the international commitments that we need to finally address and solve this problem. Are they solvable at all? And the recent book that he has written has received much attention and gives us some very important insights on that issue. He also brings with him, coming from Europe, a perspective from Europe, which in many ways has had often very different opinions from the United States when it comes to what the ideal approach is internationally. So I hope that you will also share some of the views from our home continent. I was born in Europe. And finally, then we switch to Valerie Karplus, who is Assistant Professor of Global Economics and Management at the MIT Sloan School of Management. And importantly, she's the director of the Tsinghua MIT China Energy and Climate Project, which makes her one of the most knowledgeable experts in the United States, if not perhaps the expert, on what is happening in China in terms of energy and climate policy. And she can share with us some insights on how this now, in the meantime, largest emitter in absolute terms, will be tackling with the challenge of decarbonizing its economy over the next several decades. And what that means for a developing country, or at least a country that is formally still known as a developing country. So we have, I think, really an excellent roundup, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming our panel, and starting out with Jacoby.
Okay, so I'm gonna, that was awfully fast, so I'm gonna go through it again really slowly. We are in a process of launching a new regime. Now, what I mean by a regime is not the framework convention itself. That sets the structure within which you would construct what I would call a regime. Kyoto was a regime, in just the language that I would use. So we are 1 month away from the start of this meeting in Paris. So I want to talk about what I think is going to happen, what the implications are, and some things that you might watch for if you're watching the news going into Paris, and hope to set the stage for a discussion on ourselves and with you about this issue. Now, just to put everybody on the same page. Here's just the history of greenhouse gas emissions. This is CO2 since about 1990. And what Michael was saying is in 92 we create the framework convention, the overall structure, and then the Kyoto Protocol comes in 1997. The Kyoto Protocol, which is the first time there was some agreement by some nations to do something about emissions, and there was 18 years of trying to make this work by people working really hard. One of the people who worked hardest to try to make this work was Michael Grubb. And over this period, we essentially had a system which was based on legally binding national targets, agreements to cut by a certain amount from some base year period, applying only to the richer countries, and to be a legally binding agreement, a little bit like the one that had been done for the ozone destroying gases. And in Copenhagen, as Michael said, it came apart in complete disagreement, and there were heads of states there, the small group of heads of state, completely outside the rules of the United Nations and the Framework Convention, came up with a 3-page document for another way to think about this. And the regime was shifted at that point from legally binding national targets and timetables to a system of pledge and review, voluntary pledges and review. And then, as he said, when you come to the Durban platform, that's when the negotiators get together and say, all right, now we need to take this new system and try to make it a fully elaborated regime. And the negotiators are given instructions to prepare for an agreement to come to conclusion in Paris next month, beginning on the 30th of this month, for 2 weeks to pull this together. Now, what were the instructions to the negotiators? So the instructions to negotiators, this is the agreement among the negotiators of what they tell themselves to try to work out over this period, is that first of all, they're supposed to note with grave concern the 2-degree target. We can talk about that if you want, but there is this a target to limit the rate of the total growth and the total increase in the temperature because of greenhouse gases. By the way, this whole discussion, if you came to discussion of whether or not climate is a problem, this is the wrong room. So this is a problem and talking about how we're going to deal with it. And the way this was to be structured, what pledges are defined as nationally determined contributions. You notice the word contribution. We don't use the word commitment anymore. It's a contribution. Again, the softening of the notion of the commitment. So what those are pledges, voluntary pledges for targets or actions to be achieved by 2020, an agreement starting to go into effect in 2020, an agreement agreed this year, and then there'll be some sort of a review process of these. And then later, in a later meeting of this COP, the Conference of the Parties, which took place a couple of years later, there was an additional part added to this, which is important for what we're going to talk about here. They added the notion that the nations who were supposed to pledge to these nationally determined contributions, think about emissions reductions next month, but ahead of time they were supposed to come out with their indicated nationally determined contributions. And they were supposed to do that beginning about last March for the countries that were ready, and everybody was supposed to pretty much done it by now. And almost everybody has done it by now. So on the website of the Framework Convention, there's this elaborate website with all the pledges that people have made, the indicated pledges, which in our view is what you're going to get in Paris in terms of what people would commit to. The original idea may have been to have people make initial commitments, and when they saw what the implications were, they would then commit more between then and the Paris, but our view is that's not going to happen. So that's the system. Now, I'm focused on mitigation, lowering emissions, trying to stop or control or limit the amount of temperature increase. But there are a lot of other themes here. It's a very complicated business. There is adaptation is an issue, finance, technology transfer, capacity building. It is a huge and complicated negotiation with many separate issues. A hugely controversial issue now is the whole notion of loss and damage, that richer nations have an obligation to compensate developing countries for loss and damage by climate change, because of climate change. So this is, I'm happy to come back later, I'm sure we're happy to come back later and talk about what all the conflicts are here. But if I start into that, I'll run over my time. And then in Copenhagen, there was a commitment made in Copenhagen that the richer countries would commit to mobilize, this is another one of these diplomats' words, to mobilize $100 billion in aid for mitigation and adaptation per year by 2020. I'll come back to that. I'll say now that it's hard to do that and it's too small. So just to state the condition. Now I can't give you the impression, you tried, I can't do it, to give the impression of what this is like, what this negotiation is like. I just made a picture. That's Durban. That's the picture. Just one of the smaller meetings in the Durban negotiation. You have to imagine this negotiation takes place in a meeting where there will be 40,000 people. So there might be 15,000 people who are the representatives of the nations, the national teams, maybe 15,000 people, I'm guessing, maybe 10,000 press, and then thousands and thousands of people from civil society and such, and those people who can get into the hall. And all these things are being negotiated at once. Now, we have taken in our group, we have looked at these indicated national contributions. We've done a lot of discussion with people in different countries about what we think they would actually do. What measures would they actually take to cut emissions, looking at things they'll do in the power sector, in the transport sector, in the housing sector, and then in land use and the like. To give our estimate of what, given what's been said thus far and what other conversations we've had, making judgment about how much would actually be what would be the actual performance. What do we think is going to happen? This is our estimate. So in order to do that, we have an all singing, all dancing economic model, which I also spare you for the time, but that's what we do. But now I need to show you that this model has 16 regions, and you'll see the individual countries and then some aggregate regions. So, but we will, later I'll show you a picture where countries are divided into the developed countries, like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, Europe, United States, Japan. The rest of the G20, which is these countries, plus an aggregate, which is dynamic Asia, and then what we classify as the rest of the world, which is the rest of these mainly developing countries. So I put this up so you'll see what these categories are. We have a model, the details of these economies that we use to analyze this. So what do we think is going to happen? Well, first, because we were doing some cost analysis, which I don't discuss here, we have a baseline, which is what we thought would have taken place from the Copenhagen Agreement based on what we thought was going to happen. So I'm not going to talk much about that. You see it on the figure, but I'm going to use it. What's important is what do we think will be the emissions projection based on what is taking place in the path to Paris. So you see this, you see the Paris result, and the first thing I want to say is that a lot has been achieved. As we say, instead of having an agreement where just some countries are supposed to do something about emissions, everybody is obligated to do something. And second, everybody is saying something they're going to do. That's true. And there's about in 2030 about a 14% reduction below this baseline. The baseline is sort of arbitrary, but things are happening. But clearly, it's not enough. And the view that we take, the view that I've taken about this, is that if we can't stop the growth of greenhouse gas emissions in this period to 2035, 2040, and start the global emissions going down in this period, then it's not just that 2 degrees C is out in the rearview mirror. A lot worse things than 2 degrees C are in the rearview mirror. So I've sort of lost interest in projections of 2100. The question is, are we going to do what needs to be done now? Because if we don't do that, the rest of the situation is much more uncertain and very dark. So I just show you one thing. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is another group you need to know about. International group that do studies of these. They've done a lot of studies of paths of emissions that lead to various future conditions. And one of the ones that I use is a path that leads to a particular concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. I'll use 530 to 580 parts per million CO2 equivalent. So what's the concentration in the atmosphere that a particular path is consistent with based on a lot of studies. And there's the path. Now that path, if you can get into that path during the next few decades, you're at least on a path to something in the range of, let's say, 3 plus degrees, not 2 degrees. Maybe between 2 plus to 3 plus degrees, not 2 degrees. And so the question is, how are we going to get into that path? So I'm going to make 3 points. The 3 words to carry away: review, cycles, and finance. So the first point I want to make is review. Is that one of the things they need to agree in the pledge and review system is you need a credible, believable system of review of performance. And this is a very controversial issue, which I'm happy we could spend a lot more time on what the problem is there. But it's a very controversial issue of sovereignty and potential embarrassment and the like. But that's very important even to get to the Copenhagen part. Then, even get from Copenhagen to the Paris part, that's important to achieve in Paris, and it's not going to be easy. And then the next step is to recognize that Paris is only the very first step in a very long process that has to take place. And so what has to happen is that we have to evolve in Paris, not just to get the things that they've agreed to in the indicated contributions, but to develop a set of cycles. 5-year cycles is what is being discussed of renewal and toughening and upgrading of the contributions countries say they're willing to make. And that also is a process that has not been worked out in detail, but needs to be worked out in at least the fundamental political judgments have to be made in Paris. To even get into anywhere near the window of something that's like way over 2 and maybe less than 4 degrees. If I wanted to show you 2 degrees, it's much worse than this, but I'm trying to be realistic about what might be possible. I will say, since some of you may be looking at these numbers, that you can get different answers for this projection with the Paris commitments, because that number depends on a number of things. It depends on the growth rate you assume, and whether or not you take account of potential leakage from one country to another, and what you think is the actual performance under the pledges that people have made. And there's a huge uncertainty, of course, about all that, but particularly about land use. So, but most of them are within 2 or 3 gigatons of that number, plus or minus 2 to 3 or 4%. Now, what do we have in 2030? So what's happening? What underlies that projection? And I'll just show you 2030. So here are the regions I told you about, and this is the expected post-Paris emissions in 2030. Given the Paris Agreement and what we think will happen, here's the result. Now, what happened? The developed countries are going down. So we project that's happening. We are stabilized emissions and beginning to decline. China has, as we'll hear more about, China has pledged to stabilize its emissions by 2030, 2035, and we think that's reasonable. The rest of the G20, leaving out India, is also roughly stable based on what people are saying they're going to do and what we believe is actually going to happen. And then you have the rest of the world. And here is one point I want to focus on for my third point, is that you have a huge amount of growth in emissions that we expect in India and in Africa and in the rest of that world group. And one of the problems that we have, that I've come to focus on in thinking about this, is that for a lot of these countries, their ability to do this is going to be heavily influenced by the ability, both about the supply of finance to aid that, and by their ability to receive and use the finance. And I just point that out by looking at some of the conditional, some of their INDCs, indicated national determined contributions. Algeria says they'll do their contributions conditional on external assistance. Colombia, subject to provision of favorable aid. Kenya, subject to international support in the form of finance. India, the country's climate change actions to 2030 will require $2.5 trillion in additional financial resources. They don't mean that's all coming from outside, but a lot of it probably does. And so, and yet we have a pledge by the developed countries to come up with $100 billion. The OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, has estimated in 2014 there's a lot happening there. It's about $60 billion. But most of that $60 billion, 3/4 of that $60 billion is public money coming through international banks and the like. Very hard to expand that because it has to come out of public budgets to support those kinds of activities. And so private finance is relatively small, and getting the private finance is going to be difficult because this is a business school. You have to create the incentives, you have to create the conditions where there are financeable activities which is not only that there's some pool of money to do that from, but that you've got countries that have the institutions that can actually manage that. So that's what I think is going to happen. And I would say if you're going to watch this issue, there are 3 things to keep an eye on as we go forward. First of all, the question of whether the whole thing doesn't blow up. There's a lot of conflict which we haven't talked about here. I'll just make one point that As of last February, there was a negotiating document which was 90 pages long, single space, font 10, or font 11. And over several procedures, the chairs of the convention were asked to come up with a short document, and they came up with what they call the chair's non-paper, which was their short document, which is about 10 or 15 pages. It went into the last negotiating session last week and came back at 55 pages. The meeting kind of blew up over, and so nobody knows exactly what will happen, but usually the diplomats do work it out. But certainly what we think we need to focus on is there going to be a credible, timely review process? Can we solve these problems of monitoring and verification? And will there be a credible process of update? And finally, outside, there'll be a lot of rhetoric in the Paris about finance and calls for more money. But that's not where it takes place. It takes place in all your countries and my country and in the host countries over the subsequent times. This is going to be the kind of effort that will produce the money that it will take to help those developing countries avoid the kind of growth that we see coming over the next 35 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jake, Michael, for the invitation, etc. That's all set the scene very well. I was trying to think of a more interesting than title than prospects for COP21, or etc. And I found myself sort of starting various sentences that began with half of this or half of that, or getting half the perspective, and so I ended up just calling it kind of half. And you will hopefully see what I mean in one or two respects about this. As Jake said, and as we've both been around this area for quite a while, possibly too long. Some comments on history made, I'll touch very briefly. I actually want to try and give you a little bit of a flavour of the process and Paris, a little bit on the numbers as well, and then sort of round up. So this is broadly what Michael and Jacob have both taken you through in terms of the COP cycle now reaching its grand 21st anniversary and coming of age. Couple of things. One I think maybe just worth saying, the history is a dangerous thing, but it's useful if one learns from it. And I think one of the keys is this regime learning, and I think to some extent, yes. Jake referred to Kyoto. I was quite involved in that. Way back in the 90s, I'd been, in fact, somewhat persuaded by sort of the US arguments around the efficiency of cap and trade and the US position under Clinton, etc. And just one remark on that, which is it is very interesting looking back. Partly, I think there were schisms that emerged. I found myself, found myself in quite major disagreements with a colleague that I'd done work with earlier, David Victor, who I'm sure many of you know. Looking back, I actually draw the conclusion that we all underestimate just how the same instrument can look different in different places for actually very good reasons. And in a sense, I look back and think, do you know what, actually, what we were really arguing about, we were both right, even though we were saying opposite things. What I mean by that is that I think in the European context, having a legally binding structure with a hard quantified target in international law was extremely helpful for the European domestic political process. It's something the European Commission could grab hold of, said we have to meet this commitment, it is an obligation that Europe has signed up to, the ratification process. That was the legal basis upon which Europe could introduce its legally binding cap and trade carbon pricing system. The Kyoto targets defined and gave the ammunition for the European Commission to police the emissions trading system so there weren't excessive allowances. So the whole thing actually made sort of a lot of sense in European political and legal structures, and at the time looked pretty effective. And I think David's point was also absolutely right, which was in the US it completely backfired. It almost created an sort of climate constituency because the US Congress was not going to sign up to something like that. Inevitably, the mandate that Al Gore had for pushing it, agreeing it, was extremely shaky. And of course, US withdrawal from the treaty was then, the whole international process was floundering around on exactly how to move forward. And the whole thing had been structured in a way that developing countries felt, well, that's the kind of industrialised countries' admission that they caused the problem. It's their job to lead solutions to it, and whilst they're still, warring amongst themselves, we don't need much. So it was not a very productive process. But one of the things you have to learn is kind of listen to what different parties are saying and why they're saying it, and how you can try and craft ways around that. Because this is a very big, complicated issue that involves some very deep questions about national governance, how countries view international law, their willingness to accede to it, and so forth. Now, turning to the more recent process, Michael mentioned the collapse of Copenhagen. By any standards, it was a pretty dramatic global negotiation collapse. It has also been called one of the most successful failures in UN negotiating history, because in a way it was collapsed over a very fundamental thing, which was the schism over a regime which was, the developing countries wanted to continue with legally binding commitments on the industrialised countries, versus a growing view that, well, it's a global problem, we're all in it together, unless we have a global structure, there ain't no point. So you might say it was worth a serious fight. I mean, it's much more complicated, the arguments also are still about the evolution of the system. But what emerged from Copenhagen was indeed the couple of pages that could be hammered out, and because there was no credible alternative, that then, at the next COP, got accepted as a legitimate part of the global negotiating process, which it hadn't been at Copenhagen. And in that sense, so put at the bottom, in effect, what we have had is a 6-year process of, well, you might want a regime to solve this problem that is both broad and deep in its ambition. We've never had that. We had a regime which was deep but narrow, i.e. legally binding, tough, hard, one could argue fairly ambitious targets, a commitment for rolling 5-year targets, but it was narrower. It got much narrower when the US pulled out, Canada pulled out, Russia didn't sign up to the second period. It got narrower and narrower, and a regime which is frankly deep but so narrow there's hardly anything standing on it doesn't get you very far. So the agenda effect must broaden the whole thing. Inevitably, always, the corollary is kind of the broader you go, the shallower it gets. And Paris, to some extent, is the culmination of that process of saying, we need to go broad. And you just look at the numbers around China, the emergence of the developing countries and major emerging economies, and you see, yeah, we kind of have to go broad. The result is pretty shallow, certainly in an institutional sense. That, I came into this, Jake, in 1990, Chatham House, 25 years ago. Guess what the words were then? Pledge and review. That was the view being pushed, that countries should pledge and then you should review it. That was the structure discussed 25 years ago, but then broadly for developed countries. Now, it is exactly the same words, pretty much the same concept, but for everyone. You can have lots of theological discussions, is that progress or not, but it's where things are. So, that's sort of broad context. We now have the pledge bit. This is a chart that shows various of the scenarios of global emissions. What I've done, so this is a kind of 2-degree-ish type trajectory, 3-degree-ish type trajectory, and the higher baselines that take us up and up. As Jake said, when you add up all of these INDCs, and I hope by now you know what the language stands for, you kind of end up somewhere around there. it's a little bit fuzzy because there's so many sort of conditionalities, potential overlaps and stuff. But you end up somewhere there. You're definitely not on a kind of 2-degree trajectory. Some people would say you're comfortably within the 3-degree. I think that's probably an ambitious, an optimistic take on it. But certainly one of the ways it has been framed is, well, we were on a 4-degree trajectory, we're aiming for 2. The INDCs at the moment get us halfway there, and there's more work to be done. Now, I threatened you with some numbers before I get back to the policy and regime, and I did want to walk you through some numbers that I find rather interesting, and with quite a significant purpose behind them. But another sort of half and half, or should we say alternate ways of looking at it, is whether you look at the global numbers, and Jake started and showed just how depressing those global numbers look. And you also look at the totals, and you see just how much China has risen in terms of its impact, being now the world's biggest emitter. But the other lens that will be used, and used particularly by the emerging and developed countries, is a per capita one. And they'll talk about per capita emissions and per capita wealth. So I just wanted to have a quick look, because it's quite an interesting sort of story that emerges. Partly because it just challenges some perceptions that where you get richer you emit more. Well, no. For 50 years that has not really been the case. So if you look at the US trend, so what I've done here, to be really clear, is vertically is per capita emissions per person. This is CO2, not overall greenhouse. Horizontally is wealth. And you plot over time. So 1960, the US GDP was around $20,000 per capita. It was shooting up a good pace, 5–6% growth, emissions growth per year, growth in GDP and emissions. You get the 1973 oil shocks there, big recession, emissions went down. Got to 1979 oil shocks, big drop in emissions, and the US emissions were roughly stable for around 30 years per capita. Then the 2008, you can see again, substantial economic recession, drop in emissions. So far, the US has emerged slowly from that recession with still declining emissions per capita. There is, however, another take on it. I don't want to dwell too much on this, but I think you're going to hear a bit more about it, which is, but that's kind of cheating, because that's territorial emissions, not what US consumers are driving. I'll show the European numbers in a minute. This is our best estimate of what's happened with US consumption emissions, i.e. the footprint of consumers in the US. And the US at that period was a net exporter of carbon-intensive goods to the rest of the world, and over time it moved to being quite a significant net importer of carbon-intensive goods. You can argue about, well, how much does that matter, what does it show, etc. What I'm saying is, statistically, there's a counter-argument. Well, the US never did kind of stabilise its emissions properly until the recession, which incidentally hit imports substantially more than the territorial. When you look at the European numbers, Europe was lagging somewhat in GDP. It's always been substantially lower per capita emission for a whole bunch of reasons. We can dwell on with interest, but there's that kind of discrepancy there. But the pattern is kind of similar in the sense that you had several decades of stable per capita emissions on a territorial basis, but Europe is a bigger net importer of emissions. And but overall, actually, if you pick out, say, well, it's just everything getting worse, you say, well, our territorial emissions, both the US and EU, have kind of kept them stable. What about China? Well, what you find is China has sort of grown astronomically since 1990. You multiply what is now 7 tonnes per capita by 1.3 billion people, you get a phenomenal amount of global emissions. But it's basically at the level that Europe was in 1960, and in fact that Europe is today. And that's on its territorial emissions. Obviously, China is, to a degree, the world's workshop producing manufactured goods, so its own consumers are significantly lower. About 20–25% of Chinese emissions are associated with exporting goods for others. Why is that relevant? Well, kind of maybe. Obviously what happens globally is going to be strongly influenced by China, and whether it's following kind of this kind of trajectory or this kind of trajectory or something else. Is it trying to get its production emissions under control, or are we reducing our imports? So forth. Lots of games. You might say, well, they're just following in everyone else's footprints, except you then look at Mexico and Brazil and discover that they are richer at much lower emission levels. So you actually need much more critical debate about the differences amongst the major emerging economies as well. This is getting an increasingly diverse world in terms of the kind of performance, the metrics, the measures. If you want to know about India, by the way, it's about here. It's just getting squiddly to put it on. But again, over 1 billion people will carry a lot of weight depending upon the path they take. Now, I confess I put this up partly because I just find it a fascinating diagram. You could take any of the global scenarios and think, well, what I imply is the US going to have to try and get down here? Possible? Is the EU sort of, EU's 40%, which is on territorial, is basically to kind of get that here. Probably, depending on how its economy. France is already in this area. I didn't want to over-clutter it. But, really the big issue is 4/5 of the world population is still here. And where's it going? Does it stay out here to there? That will do a lot in terms of driving global emissions. But right away, you see the potential for everybody arguing with everyone else and blaming everyone else and saying they have a greater role, and that has to an important degree been the history of negotiation. Okay, so sorry for that detour with numbers, but I think it's quite an interesting sort of framework to just sort of play around with, deconstruct the global scenarios. Who are you really expecting to do what at what kind of wealth levels, etc. So, just now to pull back towards the international regime itself, my own area is energy economics, and therefore interested in the whole mitigation agenda, but as Jake said, actually, to some extent, so that's a kind of industrialised country focus. A lot of the rest of the world, the other half, tends to say more about, well, hang on a minute, where's the international finance in this? How credible is it? Whose is it? Where's it going? How will it be governed, etc., etc. Adaptation, because we are clearly already seeing substantial climate change. Loss and damage, an explosive issue, which in fact most of the industrial world has desperately tried to stop getting on the agenda, but I think probably now has admitted it can't. It is going to be there about when you've hit beyond the limits of adaptation, people have been hurt, killed, etc. by climate change. Ultimately, what are the responsibilities and the attributions? Technology is a hugely important issue analytically, potentially in terms of solutions, and there has been progress in the technology area, but it's still relatively low profile compared to the other things. And I think the reason is partly, again, a legacy of suspicion. Everyone agrees technology is an important part of the solution, but when they hear the words broadly, what the industrialised countries hear, or fear, is another round of arguments about who owns the intellectual property, are they being forced to give it away, finance it, etc., rather than a really constructive engagement as to how do you effectively accelerate the diffusion of low-carbon technologies. So I'm not expecting any major progress on the technology agenda from Paris. By the way, I should have said, I am 90% confident that Paris will reach a deal. I see no sign that it's going to be a complete train wreck. Partly there's no such fundamental schism. Most people feel you cannot afford another failure, therefore expectations have already been dropped so low, it's kind of hard to see why you would have a fundamental train wreck in terms of what I said about going shallow but broad. But I think it's also relevant to say the geopolitical context is probably about as good as you could possibly hope for in most respects. China is in a fundamentally different position from where it was 6 years ago. And it's not just that it said, yeah, it will peak emissions before 2030, but it has been saying with increasing clarity, and I'm sure Valerie will say a bit more about this, and determination, it has already pilot trading schemes on emissions trading, cap and trade, and it will have a federal system across China. And just a month ago or so said, and that will be in operation by 2017. In fact, going straight on to Beijing from here, I'm on one of the advisory groups on that system. And it you get a real sense of energy coming out of China of a whole generation of people wanting to try and get to grips with this problem before it's too late. The US administration clearly is pushing hard for a deal. You have various stuff going on at state level, the regional initiatives in the US, obviously the EPA progress. The sense in the rest of the world is it may be horribly messy, but the US is making progress on this issue, perhaps more than expected, and certainly the administration, which drives the international negotiations, has absolutely got a lot of energy focused on getting a deal. And only 2 months ago, there were two problems in this in terms of at least the rich world, namely Canada and Australia, of which the heads of state have both changed in a very positive and helpful way for the negotiations. So we're not going to have this kind of deep internal difficulty within OECD about some fundamentally countries aren't really sure if they want the problem solved anyway, to be, if I may be so crude. You've got much more accommodating governments, Canada and Australia. So I think that enables a bit more political energy to be released to focus on the global deal. And I think some of the dynamics and concepts have also been improved by technological advances in the sense that there are solutions emerging. You kind of hear more and more talk about climate-compatible development, decentralised solar being actually a better solution to some of developing country needs. But, hey, there's 200 countries out there. You will never get them all aligned, all in a positive place at the same time. For political and structural reasons, there will be a lot of difficulties with the oil exporters. Russia has a long history of being uncomfortable with this regime, with this issue. They feel it has also on several occasions been a symbol of betrayal by the rest of the world, or isolation of Russia, or not taking Russia seriously. Again, when you look at all the headlines, 95% of it is a kind of internal industrial or a north-south discussion. How do you think the Russians are going to feel when they arrive in Paris? They're an ex-superpower. They are going to let people know that, and they have their concerns. And then there are some countries, generally known as ALBA, or a like-minded group, who are, shall we say, take a somewhat more ideological approach on some of these issues, and unquestionably will be difficult. But nevertheless, I think the omens are pretty good in terms of the geopolitics. And then finally, that's my final remark on the Paris. People are kind of, in the 90s, got much too excited about what the international system could deliver. Almost as though you send diplomats off to a conference, they reach an agreement, they come back and everything changes and gets implemented. Well, the world doesn't work that way. We know it doesn't work that way. It's certainly not on an issue like this. Paris is also, therefore, going to see a huge diversity of other activities, numerous diverse sectors of society, much more actively encouraged than before. I mean, people said, great, there's mayors, there's cities, there's local authorities, there's industry groups, being positive, etc. But now the UNFCCC has sort of created a whole space and encouragement and said part of the UN's job is to encourage civil society to get to grips with this in its own ways. The UNFCCC also cannot be the forum for serious implementation. It can set goals. That's its core role. But you can't have a serious discussion about carbon pricing or design of trading systems with 200 countries. It doesn't work that way. What I think we should very, very much hope, but is to me at the moment, and about Jake, still a little unclear, is you really want a common accounting system at the UN level, where you really get into a mess if every country starts counting its progress in its own way. And so there was a phase in which it looked awfully like Japan was basically saying it would meet its commitment partly by exporting efficient technologies to developing countries and claiming the emission reductions, without any consultation whether the developing countries agreed that those were Japan's emission reductions, not theirs. So huge proliferation of double counting would really undermine the credibility of the system. And that is a very crucial thing that really should be sorted at the global level. And a lot of people miss, there's been the discussion, maybe some of you were at the Harvard event last night. It's not just, it's almost seen, the phrase gets used, well, maybe the whole UN thing is a complete failure, and instead we need another approach. a clubs approach. Countries that are serious will get together, sort it out. Forget the UN's waste of time. It doesn't work that way. And I don't think shouldn't, needn't, etc. The point is there are certain things that is useful to do at a global level. There are certain things to be done at a sub-global level, which still coordination is useful in. That's where this discussion about clubs comes in. When you read the UN Convention, it not only says, well, it might be all right if countries get together and do other things. It says positively the UNFCCC has a duty to encourage and support countries getting together in smaller groups to further the implementation. And this is something I've seen evolving over the last year from a certain nervousness in the negotiating community about what all this club stuff was about, because really Paris was about the global deal, to saying we really need this clubs process to make further progress, much in the way that in the World Trade Organization, nobody really believes that every trade progress on everything should be agreed under the WTO. The basic deal in the WTO is you get a whole proliferation of regional trade agreements, TTIP, you name it, etc. The common currency is if they further the ambition of the global trade regime, they are welcome. And here I think we need to see, encourage and get much more used to that nature of the relationship. You have a framework convention, it's called framework for a reason, then an awful lot comes down to what the countries do underneath that in their own. So is the jar half empty or is it half full? Hey, you can be either. You can look at lots of things in lots of different ways, and at the end of the day there's a new generation emerging which will ultimately decide the answer to that question.
Great, thank you, Michael, and thank you for two wonderful, I think, springboards for what I'm about to say about China. So I'll keep my remarks very brief so that we have time to get to all of your questions. I think all of you are, of course, aware that China plays a very important role in global climate negotiations. And my remarks today about China aren't just going to focus on China, but also on what it implies for other developing countries or rapidly emerging countries as they try to balance significant challenges in reducing emissions while at the same time growing their economies, improving the livelihoods of their populations. And so basically the challenges that these countries face are all along these lines. Maybe they haven't confronted a situation of significant industrialization the way that China has, but indeed climate change and local pollution loom large in many countries, particularly in India and other parts of Asia as well. China is today the world's largest energy user and CO2 emitter. I think even that red band captures the upward revision that was recently announced for China's emissions, resulting from higher estimates of coal use. Nevertheless, this is striking, and the error bars, I think, are less important than where China will go next and what that means in the global negotiations. So we also know that the energy system is not only a source of CO2, but it's a source of local pollution. This is seen from Beijing, but we often see Beijing in the news. It's not just Beijing, it's the neighboring cities. Cities across China, and even to some extent the problem is worse in places like India. These are just two scenes from recent winters in northern China. Now, let's go to some numbers focusing on China's energy system. So China's, basically, there are just a few things you need to know about these four graphs. The first is that China uses a lot of coal, largely in the industrial and power sectors. Its energy system, the structure of its energy system is in terms of primary energy use, more than 70% of that is still coal use. Coal is not just used in power generation, as it is the case in many industrialized countries. It's also used heavily in industry and also in district heating systems, as well as in coking and iron and steel production. And indeed, China has been responsible for most of the increase in Asia's energy demand over the last several decades. Now, when we come down to drivers of CO2 emissions in China, and again, the drivers are going to be important for thinking about what commitments China can sign up to, you can see here that actually Michael mentioned exports. So number 2, exports from China account for actually 20% of China's CO2 emissions. That's fairly striking, right? So if you think about it, goods produced in China that are shipped elsewhere account for 20% of domestic emissions. Now, as I mentioned, the country is overall highly energy intensive in terms of its economic structure, and so there are active efforts now as the country modernizes to try to shift the energy structure away from energy intensive activities. And indeed, I think we can think about what China's interest in signing up to reductions in its CO2 emissions are also consistent with, strongly consistent with, the direction that the country wants to take its economy in the next several decades. And then finally, household consumption. So if we think about what consumerism, rising consumerism in China means for emissions, I think this is perhaps where you'll see the most growth. So these 4 factors are the main drivers that I see, with the first 3 actually tending over time to slowly fall and favor emissions mitigation. But then we need to think about household consumption as a driver growing from a very small base. So again, this isn't meant to indicate growth rates. What will these shifts, what will the dynamic situation actually mean in the long run for emissions in China, as well as many other countries who share some of these structural similarities? Now, just so that we're all on the same page and we can have a good discussion about this, China has signed up to several actions in its contribution ahead of Paris. You probably are all aware of China's peaking goal. China has pledged to peak its emissions by 2030 and make best efforts to peak earlier. It has also pledged to increase the share of non-fossil energy in its energy mix to 20% by 2030. And in June last year, when it officially announced the INDC, the intended nationally defined contribution, it added additional numbers in terms of a carbon intensity target, which it has had as part of previous pledges, including Copenhagen, has announced in addition that it will reduce CO2 intensity by 60 to 65% between 2005 and 2030. And that is meant to be consistent with both of the other goals above. Finally, there's language about increasing forest stock and other measures. I think importantly, this announcement, the first 2 pillars of this announcement were made jointly with the United States last November, which signaled a new era in terms of where China is in considering itself moving beyond the stage of being a developing country and signing up to tougher targets than it ever had before. Never before had China included peaking its emissions in its pledge. And I think it also signaled that the US and China, as 2 large emitters, have the potential, in my mind, are 2 logical members of a club of nations that could really seed a broader effort, along with Europe, who has been far ahead of the curve from the very beginning, to really drive global conversations and hopefully stronger actions over time. Now, in our group here at MIT, of whom a number of members of the audience are actually here, and I'm so grateful, it's wonderful to see everybody, the China Energy and Climate Project, we have been doing modeling in using essentially the daughter of EPA, the earlier model, a version of the same type of energy economic model that covers all of China's provinces, and taken that model and plugged it into a full, we call an integrated assessment framework. So the purpose of this framework is really to understand not just the energy and economic impacts of policy. In particular, in this case, we think about the impacts of a carbon price or a carbon market that China has signed up to. What the impacts are on projected CO2 emissions as well as local air pollution emissions, taken into an atmospheric chemistry model, which allow us to look at concentrations of harmful pollutants on the ground spatially across China, and then looked at how those eventually affect human health and longer term add additional costs to the economy as a result of degraded air quality. So we use this framework to really understand the total impacts of particular policies. Now, this is some more detail on the model, which I won't get into because of our time frame. I just want to emphasize that right now, this is a model that simulates the Chinese regional economy, shown here on the right, through 2030. And we've used this model in the very few scenarios that I'll show you to look at varying levels of carbon intensity reduction effort, ranging from 2% per year to 6% per year. Now we simulate those scenarios here. So these colored lines at the top indicate different levels of carbon intensity reduction. The 4% case, it turns out, is consistent with a peak in CO2 emissions in China in 2030 and the economic growth goals that the country has mapped out on that same time frame. So if growth is slower, emissions will be lower. And in fact, if we look at the CO2 emissions trajectory, we can clearly see how this works out in terms of absolute emissions, not just emissions intensity. So what I just showed you here, this is emissions intensity, and this is the absolute level of CO2 emissions under these alternative levels of effort. I should say in our project we work closely with policymakers who are interested in understanding and choosing among options. These types of analyses help to inform their thinking, and they also help to inform thinking in other parts of the world where decisions on climate change policy and international cooperation are made as well. So what we can do, in addition to forecasting CO2 emissions, I'm not showing you the precursor emissions forecasts, but what I'm showing you here is the impacts on air quality of having a carbon price that achieves the CO2 intensity target in place through 2030. So on the left-hand panel, you can see pollution in China. The red areas are the worst, the highest levels of pollution on this scale. The situation is dire. This is far worse than even today's levels of pollution. Now, under the policy, in 2030, you see significant reductions relative to that 2030 level. It is the case, though, that the pollution levels are slightly above the levels in 2010 in 2030, so that you're not actually seeing a net improvement relative to where the country started. And that, of course, is a problem because China also simultaneously has on its books efforts to improve local air quality, which would in fact require even deeper cuts in coal use and in the application of pollution control technologies, end-of-pipe solutions for example, reduction of sulfur, nitrogen oxides in power plants. So these types of additional measures will still be needed and still be required, but a carbon price plays a really important role here, and that is to deliver co-benefits from sectors of the economy where essentially you're using fossil fuels relatively inefficiently, or you can displace them with other fuels in ways that actually result in CO2 and air pollution emissions reductions. We also find that as you move to more stringent versions of the policy, you get increasingly deep reductions in PM2.5 levels. And you also see modest improvement in health impacts, going from the 2030 NP, the no policy bar, down about 10 percentage points to the scenario here indicating peak 2030. It's an improvement in the percentage of people exposed to PM2.5 levels. Again, still very high, there's more work to be done. Health effects, we also quantify morbidities and mortalities due to air pollution, and we actually, this is ongoing work, but in our most recent analysis have found that you could avoid around 2 million deaths cumulatively as a result of having a carbon price and a cap-and-trade system that is consistent with peaking in 2030. So I think I'll just conclude with some final thoughts. First of all, and I'm happy to talk about any of these more, I think China's pledge is credible, and it's not easy. It's consistent with broader efforts in China's economy to address some of the underlying structural challenges and modernization goals. It also is consistent with efforts to reduce local air pollution and broadly improve human health. Now, of course, delivering on this pledge while meeting the country's economic targets is actually quite difficult, right? So it's not, we could all say that, well, if growth is slower in China than we expect, emissions won't rise as far as we expect them to. That's a fair statement. However, back to the first slide, China is engaged in a delicate balancing act. It is obligated, its leaders feel a strong imperative to actually deliver on a promise to provide economic growth as well as low carbon development consistent with the pledge that China has made. So again, I think it'll be tough, and really delivering on this pledge will require a rethinking of existing institutions and potentially some significant institutional change. Finally, I think I'm just going to echo my fellow speakers with a hope, an optimism around the idea that one big success that I'd like to see in COP21 would be a trusted and transparent regime for monitoring, reporting, revisiting emissions levels over time. And it seems like now's the time to do it. We have the political support to do it, hopefully. So I think that could be a big win. And again, hats off to a fantastic team. The author of many of those figures I showed you is sitting right there in the middle, in the back. So congratulate her afterwards for fantastic work, as well as the whole team. So thank you very much. Looking forward to discussion.
Let's sit in front. All right, we're relatively, have a small one, thank you, Valerie. Thanks to all of you, of course. Fantastic presentations. We're relatively close to our ending time, and out of respect to your evening plans, we don't want to go too far beyond. If there's lots of questions, lots of enthusiasm, maybe we'll add 5 to 10 minutes. And rather than ask questions of my own, let's just see if there's any immediate reactions or responses. Susan?
Hi, I'm Susan Solomon from Earth, Atmospheric and Planetary Sciences here at MIT. I wanted to ask if you can help a non-economist understand how there would be significant private financial flows into this system. You know, there's been talk ever since Copenhagen of significant billions of private flow, which I don't really understand the principle there. So I would love to have you explain to me how that would work and your views of how much that could actually represent.
I think that one of many answers is that in quite a lot of categories of investment, public money can leverage private. It takes some of the risk, it buys down the upfront public, etc., etc. So you would always expect in some ways to get a multiplier effect. A lot still hinges on how you measure, what you measure, what's your baseline and what's additional to what. But you do see growing amounts of private finance into mitigation-oriented investments, renewable energy investments right across the world. Obviously partly driven by public policies that make it profitable. But I think there's still a tension negotiating in the sense that by and large the majority of developing countries would like to see the bulk of it as being public, and that of course is not the view of the treasuries in the industrialised countries. So there will remain a tension around that, but I think the combinations of direct pledges and leverage of public finance is an important part.
Yeah. For example, the Prime Minister Modi has a plan for 175 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. Now, if Indian institutional electric utilities can create market and accounting and credibility conditions, then it's quite possible that there could be investment opportunities in a utility in India that would be similar to what somebody, let's say, buying a green bond would be doing an investment in a utility in the U.S. I think this, as you can tell from my talk, I think this is the really big question. So how could this be made better? How could the international development banks that do a lot of this somehow leverage their money, leverage their assets by taking some more of the initial risk, take some of the sovereign risk, and maybe even provide some subsidies there, because I think that the type of finance that at least I argue is going to be needed cannot be had out of public budgets. You need to find some way to leverage those funds. But I think there is a huge pool of capital that's going into green investments. The green bond market's pretty big in the developed countries. Why doesn't it go across borders? Sovereign risk and the conditions of the institutions there not be able to do it. So it's problems on both sides, but I think that this is the key question. I find I've been driven into a concern about this where I really don't feel that we understand it very well. But I think it's really an important research question.
So if we can have a chance, maybe keep them short with a question mark. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. I'm with the Sloan Fellows Program and had a question related to the loss and damage issue and whether you thought there would be an increasing number of parties at the country level or at the civic group level who would resort to using the courts to solve some of these questions around responsibility for some of the issues they're suffering.
Oh, we need it back, sorry. I forgot. I thought we'd economize. Anybody here?
I think for the developed countries, I just think that the United States, this is a showstopper. And I think that there are many several reasons for that. One of the things I think is that if it becomes some international agreement that loss and damage, that compensation is somehow legally blessed by the United Nations, then it threatens to open the door to the World Court in ways that people have been trying to penetrate for a long time but unsuccessfully. So my guess is that there's a great push on the part of a number of countries in favor of this. The countries that would supposed to be compensating are essentially going to refuse, and I think this is one of the major hurdles to get over in Paris. How the diplomats write something that has these words in the document, but they don't mean very much.
It's not actually an area that I follow closely. I'm not all the way People have been talking about lawsuits for a long time. It almost seems like there's waves of enthusiasm about what we've done. One major obstacle, only one major obstacle, has been obviously the difficulty of attribution, and the science on that is slowly improving, but still hugely uncertain. I think my sense is that it will continue to play out as a pressure point rather than as a sort of definitive instrument, and that some ground will be given that falls a long way short of anything about admitting liability or compensation or anything like that, but an acknowledgement that there is, you know, an underlying moral issue here that makes the emitters feel uneasy and they want to do something to slightly assuage that, and that's part of the grounds for funding of adaptation measures, etc., and housing of refugees and so forth. My guess is it will play out in a slightly sort of informal way, but I'm not a lawyer, I could be wrong.
Well, I am a lawyer, so I should probably say something very briefly. Now, the World Court, as you probably know, is a voluntary. It has voluntary jurisdiction. That means that if countries don't agree to go to court and face a challenge or a lawsuit that another country brings, there's no hope of it ever being implemented. So if I see any dynamic, it would be at the domestic level. And we've seen cases in the Netherlands, the Urgenda case, very interesting development. In Pakistan, in Lahore, there was just a domestic court saying that the country hadn't done enough, you know, to protect its citizens against climate change. And I could see similar cases having a transboundary nature. And we've seen cases being sought, indigenous people suing under human rights treaties, but again, before domestic courts, not the international courts. If anything, maybe the dispute settlement body of the World Trade Organization is the most powerful, and it does have mandatory jurisdiction, but it wouldn't be the natural home for lawsuits on loss and damage. It would rather be something about discrimination in a trade context. Unfortunately, with time as progressed as it is, I saw two hands up before, and I wanted to give those two a chance, and I think that might be the last two that we can accommodate. To have you here, and then the gentleman in the purple suede.
Thanks. A really quick clarification question, and then another question, but they're very short. So the first one is, I'm sorry, I completely just blanked out on your name. I'm sorry, Michael, Professor Grubb. Sorry about that. So you had a graph where you listed the different ranges of 2 degrees and 3 degrees, and then you had the estimate for what the INDCs collectively, what the estimate is. I'm wondering where you got that estimate from, if that was from Dr. Jacoby, or if that was from an NREDS calculation, or where that figure came from.
That was partly a calculation of some of my colleagues at UCL.
Okay.
But there's several. I mean, there's a climate tracker website. There's actually now, I should think, at least half a dozen places that have done similar exercises and come out with similar but slightly different conclusions.
And the framework convention itself was not obligated to do that summary, and there is a document on the FCCC website that has their estimate.
Okay, so they did actually release that.
Just now.
Yes, it's in the
Okay.
website.
All right, I knew they were obligated to do that, but I wasn't sure if they had released it. And then, I don't know if we have time, but I'm curious a little bit more. You mentioned Russia, and I'm curious what their stance is in the negotiations. You kind of alluded to how they could be an outlier, a bit of a troublemaker.
Anybody want to bash Russia?
No, all I could say is Russia's not said very much, and that's very troubling. That's what's risky about it. You don't really know what they're thinking or what they may come to Paris because they've not been engaged effectively and they've not particularly come forward. And that can be a slightly risky side.
It's dangerous to talk about China and then comment on Russia, so.
I did find it remarkable. A few weeks ago, a senior official in Russia announced that Russia was contemplating a national cap-and-trade system. A day later, we hear that he was fired by Putin for saying something.
Well, Jorge Colmenares from MIT Sloan, graduate in '96. I'm currently part of Mythical, which is an alumni group here at MIT, pushing for climate action leadership. I want to go back to Professor Salomon's point regarding the private funds. that must be needed in order to address this problem that we have at hand. And Professor Jacoby also kind of brought up that question. And particularly focusing in China, because Professor, you brought up a greatest point, which is they took a decisive, obviously it's China, so they can make decisions like that, but they took a decisive approach with carbon pricing. And I was kind of half full type of person until I saw that the protocol going to COP21 reduced from 150 pages to 17 pages. And primarily because all the teeth went out. And precisely in terms of carbon pricing, I mean, do you see any future? I mean, I know it's kind of off the table for COP21, but do you see any future China and meetings with the US trying to kind of bring other big emitters into bring carbon pricing? Because that's for sure one of the ways we can bring private investment back to the table.
And it connects nicely to a discussion we had last night with Bill Nordhaus.
So I think that China's announcement that it would put in place a cap and trade system by 2017, when it was announced publicly, the summit, the Xi-Obama summit in September, sent a pretty strong signal to the U.S. And I think created planted the seed. Let's say it planted the seed that perhaps, again, the U.S. might revisit carbon pricing. It's, again, I would say we've gone down the regulatory path so far. So the focus on vehicles and power plant regulations. But I think the most optimistic people I know inside the EPA who think about markets are just waiting for that window of opportunity. So outside the U.S., I think China signing up to a carbon market is a tremendous signal to other emerging market countries who could potentially develop similar systems. Now, in China, though, I think the announcement was just as important for the U.S. and the world as it was for China internally, because there's been discussion of the carbon market for a while, and this basically formalized that China would move forward with this system and perhaps deprioritize other systems that are layered already over China's energy system to deal with energy conservation and other renewable targets, et cetera. So I think to the extent that this sent a signal domestically to bring the relevant players into line, I think it's important. And I'm hopeful. I agree that carbon pricing can be should be one pillar of a successful approach on climate change and to bring private finance back in. I see a big role actually for the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank to play in carbon finance, but I'll stop there.
I suppose the plane has a lot to say on that too.
Yes, I do.
There's an awful lot to say in this area, and there are many different variants on this theme of how carbon pricing will come into the system in various ways. The Chinese position obviously is hugely important. To my mind, one big question is, do they regard that primarily just a domestic play, or do they have international ambitions on the impact of their carbon pricing decision and its diffusion, whether in the US or through carbon pricing clubs and the kind of ideas we touched on yesterday? The other thing to say is there is a World Bank Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition that is emerging. There are a certain amount of discussion about the role of in effect, a directional carbon pricing as a way the financial system can itself, speaks to Susan's question, play a role if they believe the value of carbon saving is going to rise over time. And there are academics who then talk about the central bank issuing loans against a rising carbon price. The only person from a central bank I've ever heard talking about that kind of issue was from China. He basically said the central banks in the 21st century needs to be addressing 21st century issues like climate change.
Jake, thoughts on that? No?
And just as a reference, a professor from Sloan, Chris Nittell, a week ago was in front of the State House here in Massachusetts arguing for climate change. So our community is pushing for that as well locally.
Absolutely. He's my boss. He regrets not being here tonight. Unfortunately, had something come up. Maybe one very last challenge to all three of you. You were, Michael, expressing some optimism, 90% likelihood, sort of your intuition that Paris could be a success. I wonder what would happen if the 10% came to pass, and what are the two other panelists thinking about sort of the chances of, I mean, I think we all know that there is always some likelihood, some possibility that negotiations break down completely. Maybe let's just start with Michael, who's already outed himself with the percentage.
I think given the political conditions I indicated, my sense is they would do exactly what they did 14 years ago, I think it was, when negotiations broke down completely, and they simply said, well, fine, we'll get together in another 5 months and sort it out.
Right. The Hague and,
I'd be upset if it didn't work out, but I think we all would be. However, I don't think it's necessarily the end of the world. You've seen a lot of bilateral cooperation coming online in recent years, and I think there will be a void left that responsible players will step up to fill.
I agree. I think that you both put it. I agree with both of you. I think that the if it threatened to break down, there is a role for the United Nations, even though it can't be an agreement about what to do. So it could be the United Nations then would be reduced to an accounting agency, which is a useful and needed function, maybe an agreement on the accounting systems, and the action would move into the G20, which is run by not by environmental ministers but by finance ministers, or into various other coalitions, clubs, if you will. So the system wouldn't stop. That is, we tend to focus on the Framework Convention because it gets a lot of news, but there are a lot of other domains in which this discussion is going on. So, for example, the control of nitrous oxide, which is one of the greenhouse gases, that agreement is not in the Framework Convention, it's in the Montreal Protocol. It's in a totally different, so it's going on in different places. It would quickly reappear in other jurisdictions to try to, because I think the force behind it is strong. How serious that would be for the planet is we need another session.
Well, anyway, I take away sort of a message of guarded optimism, which I think is better than what we could have hoped for a couple of years ago. Thanks to the audience for staying past our time. You're applauding yourself, essentially. Thanks to my colleagues who helped make this possible. Most importantly, thanks to our panelists. And I think you just gave applause, so safe travels home or on for our panelists.